At the International Youth Foundation are 25 years old. We were founded around the notion of positive youth development that we didn't invent, but it's a theory of change for youth that started to be talked about and come into practice about 25 or 30 years ago. You could say it was ensconced very nicely in the World Development Report of 2007, which is the only World Development Report that's started back in Bob McNamara's days that's ever dealt with youth, and it's the most downloaded World Development Report in the history of the 30 years of these reports. It's a magnificent piece, and I recommend not the 500-page report necessarily, but the 40-page executive summary. And just because it was 2007, it's not outdated. It's still, I think, the best single document that talks about youth development as a transition from childhood to adulthood. And youth might be 12, 14, 16 whenever it starts, and it could be 18, 25, 29, or 35 when it ends. But it is that midway between childhood and adulthood. And the bank talks about it the way we do, and that is that youth is a transition. And when young people transition through schooling, whatever that is, 8 years, 16 years, 20 years of schooling. We have PhDs who are unemployed. So it's not how many years you have of schooling, but what kind of schooling and how do you continue your education through the rest of your life. Healthy lives, being healthy, civic engagement, leadership. Of course, voting, but being a good neighbor, a good citizen, a good participant in your community. And then, frankly, earning an income. If we get young people through school and are healthy and civically engaged but can't find a livelihood, a job, or can't start a small little business that might grow from a micro into a real business, we won't have then an economic and political dividend from this young cohort coming into our societies and ultimately becoming taxpayers, being participants in the formal part of our economy. So IYF and CSIS have a commitment to seeing that all these youth transitions flow through in a way that we can make it youth not as a separate little special interest group off to the side. Heck no, if it's 20 to 30% of the population of many countries today, and it's up to 35% of some African and Middle Eastern countries, that's not a special interest group. That is a demographic reality. So our 3D series that we are inaugurating today is all about the demography, the demographics of this, the dynamics, good and bad, of what young people can provide to society and their communities by having a successful, healthy transition to adulthood. And again, adulthood, in my words, is being a healthy adult, a good parent, civically engaged, and employed, or earning an income. That would be the outcome we'd want. The outcome of a youth development program is an adult. And when societies get it right, guess what? You get a 50-year return on investment because that 20-year-old will live another 50 years. When we don't get it right, and they don't get it right, first of all, it'll probably be a 30 or 40-year negative return on investment because a lot of people will die earlier because they're not healthy, they're not employed. But they also won't be paying taxes, won't be raising sustainable families, and societies pay the price when you've got that kind of youth dynamic and demography, if you will. So the 3Ds are demographics, the dynamics of youth, and then really for development of them as young people and future adults, and really development of our community societies and the peace, prosperity, and relations that CSIS and all of us, I think, are looking for. That's why we created the series. In the same spirit, we created a year ago with the Center and with Hilton Worldwide the first ever Global Youth Wellbeing Index, and their copies are back here. It has a web page all its own, although it's on our web page too. This is a very slim version of the data that's behind the 30 countries that were in it, but our goal with this, with CSIS, was to create what I'd call an investor's guide and a diagnostic tool. And maybe it should be a diagnostic tool first before, of course, you make your investments. But it's not a name and shame index like some other indices should be. If you're talking about doing business, the IFC's famous index, or if you're talking about a human development index, or a human rights index, naming countries for what they are and maybe even shaming them into trying to do things differently is a good idea. Not here. This is about trying to understand the dynamics of youth well-being or not so well-being in countries. Not to compare them and rate them. The 30 countries that are in here are actually 70% of the world's population. But we did this to better understand the dynamics, like the World Development Report of 2007 lays out. The domains in our index are the same sort of transitions that the bank talked about in its report. It's a domain of education, of health, of economic opportunity, meaning employment, jobs, and ability to earn an income, citizen participation, safety and security, and ICT. There's also a place in the index for youth to give their own voices for how they see their futures and their societies. This then becomes a way of understanding where governments themselves, philanthropies, think tanks, NGOs, corporate social responsibility programs, all the potential investors that want to improve the well-being of youth, where would you invest if you want to do that? So it becomes a diagnostic tool and an investor's guide, if you will, to improve well-being around the world. So our Youth 3D series borrows off of this joint commitment of CSIS and IYF, a concrete example of a corporation coming in and being our partner in developing an index and working on this series and future events, all to get the issues out there for a fulsome discussion of what it takes to breed the type of development or demographic dividend that we want for societies. China is, of course, a country unique in the world. It's made some phenomenal success and progression in the last 20 or 30 years. There are 300 or 400 million Chinese today that are in the middle class of China and the middle class of the world that weren't there only a generation or two ago. Same sort of thing is happening in India and a few other countries. Pulling that youth bulge, so to speak, into the middle class has helped China grow, but has also helped the world grow. And sometimes when China contracts, the world contracts too, and we're seeing that phenomenon going on today. But China has a very special place and is a great country to be the kickoff country for Youth 3D presentation. It also has its own dynamics. So many Chinese kids have 4 grandparents. Not many countries in the world that do, that are alive and still in their maybe 50s and 60s rather than 70s or 80s or 90s. My kids never got to know all their grandparents because we had our kids later, and or their grandparents may have had 15 or 20 grandchildren. So the one child dynamic certainly has taken China from having a very large population, and it still will be for a long time, but it won't be a youthful population 20 or 30 years from now. So that is a different dynamic too, that when we look at youth well-being, you'd want to understand the dynamics and the demography of each country that you're looking at. So every country is different, but we're trying to draw from this lessons learned that countries can share across their countries and hopefully share them in things like the Sustainable Development Goals that are about to be launched for 2030. It'd be regional goals, it'd be regional alliances, it'd be all the things that countries do internally and transnationally to improve their economic, social, and political well-being. So that's why we're here, and we're delighted to have such a stunning panel. Let me introduce then Ritu Sharma, who works for both CSIS and IYF in this partnership to bring youth into the continuum of peace, security, development, and all. Ritu is a wonderful person to take on this job because she's been an advocate on international development cooperation and issues for the last 20-some years, most of it dedicated to gender issues and young women and women of all ages. But as she was the founder of the Women's Edge Coalition that then became known as Women Thrive Worldwide, I'm proud to have served on her board for a number of years. When she decided to retire from that successful social enterprise and is known as one of the premier advocates for solid results-based development and policies around not just gender, but how gender play into the whole continuum of effective development practices, the chance to bring her to CSIS and IYF to lead a dialogue and a study of development issues over the next few years was very attractive to us. So I'm going to invite Ritu to the podium, and she'll introduce our panel. But thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate your being here for our first U3D event. I don't want to delay our conversation about China because there is so much to discuss in terms of this very unique generation or generations. So I want to ask our panelists to come join me here, and I will introduce each of them briefly. You also have their biographies on the flip side of your program. Sit in the middle.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you. So to my immediate left, we have Dr. Stan Rosen, and he is a professor of political science, specializing in China politics and society. And he has taken a particular interest in youth issues throughout his career, not just the demographics of youth, which he will tell us a little bit about, but youth, arts, culture, film, all of these different aspects of young people and how they express themselves in China and how that's changing. Dr. Scott Kennedy is here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's Deputy Director of our Freeman Chair in China Studies and Director of our project on China business and political economy. And Scott will be talking a little bit about how the youth demographics in China are interacting with the economy, with politics, and with other policy issues in China. Ms. Ang Kai-shu is here representing the International Youth Foundation's Youth Action Net. She is an alumni of a highly competitive program for young social entrepreneurs. She'll tell us a little bit about the social enterprise that she started in China and what she learned from that. She is also currently a press officer at the World Trade Organization, and I just want to underline that she is speaking solely in her personal capacity. So please don't say, quote, someone from the World Trade Organization said. She's just speaking on her personal capacity. So let us begin.
With me?
Okay. Yes, so.
Okay. Thank you very much, Richard. I was asked to talk about basic demographic data, so I wrote the numbers down and wouldn't make any mistakes. And when you're talking about demographic data in China, it's going to be large numbers. It's China after all. So let me give a couple of basic figures. The number of people, youth from the age 15 to 34, 415 million. 20 to 34 years old, 325 million. In the year 2000, 23% of the population were under the age of 15. 10 years later, by 2010, only 17% under the age of 15, as Bill said. Clearly, the population is aging. Median age, 36 years old. Urban population, about 56%. Yearly change in population growth now is about 0.61%, gone way down after the one-child policy was instituted originally. In terms of internet users, 16.6% of internet users are below the age of 18. 35.1% of internet users are 18 to 24, which means that 51.7%, or 50% of internet users were born in 1990 or after. If you look at some of the popular portals, WeChat, for example, everybody uses WeChat. First quarter of 2015, more than 480 million people were using WeChat. It's become more important than the Weibo or the microblogs for reasons we can talk about. E-commerce, very important in China. It's liberating commercial choice, especially in cities where they don't have major stores. For example, Alibaba's 24 hours Singles Day, where people buy gifts for themselves or for other people who are single, generated over $10 billion US in one day of e-commerce. Nothing in the US comes close to what Alibaba is doing in e-commerce. New college graduates, in 2000, there were about 1 million college graduates. 2013, 7 million. Big increases. Now, that means more middle-class customers. It also means more competition to get a decent job. We also talked about the rising middle class, and I've seen many, many surveys in China on how many people are in the middle class. It's impossible to come up with one number. A lot of different figures given, but let's say about 157 million. That's one of the numbers that's thrown around. People with disposable income. And the surveys are very clear in showing the kind of influence children from one-child families have on family spending patterns, 50% or so. Everyone is targeting this market. You can read a lot on various websites, read a lot on what consultants are saying. How do you attract these people to get them to buy your products or accept your faith, for example? It could be luxury goods, it could be basic necessities, it could be Hollywood films, or Christian churches. You find all of this online, and much of the writing tends to be very general. They take hundreds of millions of youth and treat them as a monolith, rather than, as I would try to do, disaggregating them into different segments to acknowledge that Chinese society is much more pluralistic than it used to be. Sometimes it makes sense to talk about them as a group, often it doesn't. When the Chinese write in their own publications, they write about generations. They think in generational terms, been that way for a long time. And now those in the West are also writing about generations. And the two generations that receive the most attention are the so-called post-80s youth, those born between 1980 and 89, 26 to 35 years old, about 240 million people, and the post-90s youth, born in the 1990s, 16 to 25 years old, about 140 million people. Post-90s youth, about 11.7% of the population, many of them college students. A lot has been written about the differences between post-80s and post-90s. I don't have time right now to talk about all the differences, but just a couple of generalizations, even though I've criticized generalizations. Post-90s youth tend to be better educated. They're more indulged by their parents, but they're also in a lot of competition and pressure to succeed. They use the internet more than post-80s youth. It's part of their life, much more even than post-80s youth. The kind of pressures the post-80s youth are under have to do with housing, getting housing, making a living, raising a family, credit card debt, all those kinds of things. But even saying that, over 60% of post-90s youth have their own credit cards. Over 42% have shopped online in terms of the surveys. If Western media has a problem understanding the younger generations, the Chinese media has gone back and forth in assessing them. Up until mid-2008, it was common to find post-80s youth under attack in the Chinese media. The Me generation, cynical, pragmatic, self-centered, China's first generation of couch potatoes, addicts of online games, patrons of fast food chains, loyal audiences for Hollywood movies, and so on. After May 2008 and the Sichuan earthquake, because so many had shown their selflessness in volunteering, the media in China began to extol their virtues, basically, and said that these people are actually good, after all, because they've imbibed traditional Chinese culture, they've benefited from the achievements of 30 years of reform and opening up. So first they were rejected, then they were co-opted. If you look at I look at a lot of so-called internal, neibu, they call in Chinese, materials from the Academy of Social Sciences and elsewhere, and then you see much more realistic assessments, I think. Some of the more recent ones, post-80s youth, ideologically unreliable. One report said they can manifest the defense of Communist Party leadership, they can enthusiastically support Western multi-party politics, they can take part in patriotic activities, but the bottom line is they're concerned for their own benefits. Doesn't matter what the political system is, as long as it ensures their development, they will support it. If it doesn't, they'll oppose it. They're very, and increasingly worldly, using the Chinese expression, 世俗化, worldly. And surveys, many surveys in China have indeed shown this generation's lack of belief in socialist core values. their instrumental mentality, their preference for Western cultural products like American TV series and films over Chinese products, and I can talk about that in more detail if anybody's interested. They've shown even strong support in some of the internal surveys, strong support for the American separation of powers political system as the best way to fight corruption in China. There's a great desire to join the Communist Party, but the surveys show because that helps you get promoted, that helps you get a job. Surveys also show a lack of any strong belief system. And this is emphasized, for example, in the Christian churches in their newsletters to their own Chinese members. How do you recruit these disaffected youth? Give them something to believe in, a strong belief system. The last thing I'll say is that later on, I hope I have time in the Q&A to talk about such things as how these youth see themselves compared to how other generations, older generations, see them. Talk about the differences and disaggregation, important differences among these youth. Why the Chinese authorities label Western culture as one of the 3 great dangers to regime control, along with internet agitation and extremism or separatism. Western culture is right up there. And to talk about the Chinese dream and the American dream and how they're competing for the hearts and minds of Chinese youth. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Stanley. That is very helpful to get a sense of how we can think about the generations in China, post-80s, post-90s, and what some of the basic characteristics are. I want to ask Ankai, still a young person, to talk a little bit about growing up in China and more of an urban setting as an only child, and what that was like. What are some of the trends that you see from your point of view? And do say a few words about the social enterprise that you ran and how you learned about what youth for rural Chinese people is like as well. So please.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Ritu. And first of all, I'm really grateful for the International Youth Foundation and the CSIS to bring me here. So I was here actually in DC in 2008 as a fellow of the International Youth Foundation. And I really find that experience fascinating because the International Youth Foundation brought 20 young social entrepreneurs from all over the world, 20 young people below 30 years age, who is really bringing a lot of positive change to the society. And I think I was deeply inspired by that experience. And I really want to be here today to kind of share my experience. So on a personal level, when I was back in university, I was involved in the social enterprise, and that's probably why I'm here today. The social enterprise was more on gender issues, the gender issues in China. We first staged the vagina monologues for the first time in a Chinese university. For those of you who probably are not that much familiar with the vagina monologues, it's a quite provocative show done by Eve Ensler, and it's composed of a lot of different pieces on how women express themselves. And so we've decided to put up the show because we thought it's a great way to express ourselves as a young urban girl. And it also gives us the language to express things. Because I think in the traditional Chinese language, a lot of things are taboos. We don't know what to say. A lot of social issues, domestic violence, or the sort of inferior position of girls in the family are deeply embedded in the traditional Chinese culture, but we don't have a language to express it. So we kind of wanted to use the vagina monologues as a way of expressing our views as young Chinese women. But then we found that the show was so American, right? There are pieces talking about the size of a feminine product that just doesn't fit into the Chinese context. So we've decided to kind of bring more the Chinese perspective, the Chinese context into the show. And so there were 2 pieces that was particularly interesting. One of them was done by another school in southwest China. It's a girls' high school. It's supposed to bring girls who didn't have the opportunity to have education to continue their high school education. And the girls who's 15 to 18 years old, really young girls, put up a piece called "I Want to Go to School." It's expressing their desire to continue their education, to find more opportunities. And there was another piece which is a bit disturbing, but it's about how families in rural areas, when they find they have a baby girl, they find that it's not to their interest. They prefer baby boys, right? So actually, there was a news report saying that they found the people abandoned the baby girls, and the body was sent to some restaurants in Canton. It's really disturbing. So some girls put up a piece about that particular news and how that brings them a lot of reflections and in the show. So I think the show itself kind of reflects the social aspect of China, especially the gender issues. And then we found that it's not just a way of expressing ourselves, it's also, we want to do something more concrete. So we also raised funds for the particular school that's giving young girls more opportunities. And then we started also some activities to send university students to rural areas in China to kind of teach them English and some other skills during the summer breaks. So that's how the enterprise is was done. So.
Could you say a little bit about some of the differences in the outlook of Chinese youth in terms of urban versus rural? It's very different cultures, really.
Absolutely. I think China is growing, right? Growing tremendously, but there's a lot of inequalities in the Chinese society, I guess. Thomas Piketty would say that it's everywhere in the world. So then we find, like, I was born in Shanghai. I went to the best university in Shanghai, and I had tremendous opportunities as a young Chinese. But look at these girls in rural Guangxi province in China. They can, so basically the Chinese government provides high school education until the year 15 years of age. And afterwards, the family doesn't want to sponsor them for further education because they know that the girls will become a property of another family soon. So they don't want to invest that much in girls. And so the disparity is shocking. And that's probably why we wanted to do something to kind of share a bit and pay back to the society in a way, yeah.
No, I think it's quite remarkable what you did, given the Chinese context. So, huge kudos to you. Before we go to Scott, I just want to share with you some of the things that our speaker, Eileen Otis, who we were hoping would be here to talk about the sex ratio imbalance in China and the dynamics around that. And so if you'll just let me share some of what she was hoping to say, and then, Scott, I want to go right to you to sort of give us the what does this all mean analysis, so you can start thinking about that. Basically, today in China, there are 30 million more females than males. And that's expected to peak in 2045 with about 40 to 50 million more males than females. So not an insignificant population. The population of the United States right now is close to 300 million or so, and that's about 1/6 of the U.S. population. So it's quite a just to think in that terms of scale. As Ankai said, very big differences between gender relations, gender equity in rural versus urban China, where only girls in the urban areas of China, and I think, Ankai, your experience really reflects this, can have lots of opportunities and can be treated much more equally as boy children, but in rural areas, that's very much a different story. Now, the question is that when you think about young, unmarried men, I think a lot of us would sort of say, oh, this is a huge problem. This means crime's going to increase. This means we're going to have much more rape. We're going to have trafficking. We're going to have, we have to figure something out to do with these men. I think one of the interesting things that Eileen wanted to contribute to this was to really frame it that young Chinese men are also an opportunity, right? As Bill was saying, that we can look at them as a potential time bomb that will go off that we have to handle, or we can look at this as a potential opportunity to begin to shift gender inequities in China as women become a scarcer resource. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that it will automatically lead to negative outcomes for women and girls. The Chinese state is certainly engaging on this issue in terms of promoting care for girls, systematic welfare for girls, and particularly in rural areas. One of the interesting dynamics that Eileen wanted to share was that in the competition for wives, women like Ang Kai will be, and men who are highly educated, who have an income, who have a car, an apartment, they have the hardware to be ready for marriage, will have the first pick, yeah, of the women. The ones who will not have that opportunity will largely be young men from poor families who don't have the level of education, they don't have the savings, they don't have the physical assets that more urban men. And I think the question is, how can we capture and channel the energy of largely that population of young men towards good causes as opposed to having it spiral into negative outcomes. So just a little bit on the sex ratio imbalance. And so Scott, we've chatted a little bit about this, and we could go in so many directions in terms of interpreting what these dynamics mean for China. But if you would just start with your specialty, which is the economics of the country. So what does all this mean?
Sure. Well, again, thanks to you, Ritu, and to Bill. I think it's a terrific partnership. I should say before I get into my specialty, just personally, this is something that's important to me. I was a youth. I was a youth in China when I was in college. I have 3 boys who also lived in China. And so from a personal perspective, I interact with lots of Chinese youth and learn a great deal from them. For my work, I should just say, I spend a lot of time looking at entrepreneurs, and most of China's entrepreneurs tend to be young people. I look at the type of businesses they run. I look at how they interact in the political, participate in politics, their foreign policy views. And then most recently, I've been leading a project on philanthropy in China. And looking at how Chinese individuals volunteer, the growth of foundations in China and NGOs, and of course the dominant participants and recipients of philanthropy in China are young people. So it's something that I care about a lot. In addition to looking at sort of generally, where is the Chinese economy going to take over the U.S. and dominate the world, or is it going to collapse in a heap? And what's that mean for foreign policy? So just lurking behind that macro, sometimes boring discussion is I've got this other stuff, motivating me, both personal and otherwise. I think that what comes through in what Ankai and Stan and you mentioned, and the data is first is that there's a lot of variation amongst Chinese youth. I mean, that's the biggest thing that stands out, whether you're talking about the urban divide, or about class divide, ethnicity. We haven't even talked about the differences between Han Chinese and others, but I mean, you can't put a model Chinese youth person and say it's going to be a lot of people, and that variation is just critical. A friend of mine, he teaches at Tsinghua University, it's a great school, and his son Daniel is in the high school associated, and this kid is just super duper smart, is going to perform well on the entrance exams, probably he'll get to go to Tsinghua or any other great school, and he's got super great life chances to do everything that Bill said that we want youth to be able to do. And then there's someone like this woman, Yang Hailian, and I'd encourage you, Andy Brown, commentator for the Wall Street Journal, wrote a great piece in January of 2014. You can just Google this piece about children that live in central and rural China whose parents have gone off to be migrants. And 61 million children left behind in China whose parents are now working in factories, either in cities in their provinces or in coast. And this 10-year-old girl is responsible for getting up at 5 a.m. every day, preparing food for her sister, who's 7, and cleaning the house, and then going to school. And then, it's a very different world. And so the first thing is the variation. And the second thing is the changes in values, the evolution in values, which has already been mentioned. China is a go, go, compete, Pete, get ahead place. I mean, just when you get off the airplane in China, your heart rate already starts going faster. Not just because you're trying to breathe more, trying to get air because of the pollution, but just it's a go-go society. And it's Chinese youth, they are trying to compete to get ahead. If you're a guy, you're trying to be one of those that's lucky enough to persuade a woman or find another partner, and to get the right job, and to have a big income, and that's just an amazing amount of pressure that I think people feel. The second thing is, in addition to that economic sort of social ladder climbing, keeping up with the Wangs type pressure, there is, the evolution of non-material values, of the importance of a good environment, of healthcare, food safety, all of these sort of non-material values. There's a professor from the University of Michigan who studied that as societies modernize, their values change. And you're seeing that in China. And China there's 21st century China, 20th century China, 19th century China, and you're seeing those values evolve as well. Politically, you're seeing values change too. These are folks who are super connected and super smart, and regardless of the Chinese governments and parties, the Communist Party's efforts to control the internet, these people have a lot of information. China is not North Korea, right? They know a lot of different things, and that puts high demands on them. And of course, hundreds of thousands of Chinese study abroad. And if you look at the data on the values of how Chinese people are studying abroad, it's really interesting. Actually, one of my grad students from Indiana University recently, who's here in the audience, and hopefully folks will talk to him. I'm not going to tell you all of the exciting stuff because I want you to read it from his thesis. But it shows that, yes, people's values change. They become more interested in a variety of different types of political contexts. But they're as nationalistic, or perhaps more, than when they got here. Being in the United States doesn't necessarily make you less pro-Chinese than before. And the same if you study probably in other parts of the world. So the first thing is that transition in variation in values. And what that means is, I'll just make 2 points, because I know we want to get to more questions in the audience as well. The first is, it puts a lot of demands on this government. This is a very wide spectrum of type of people, with very different types of views, very different needs, who have high expectations for themselves, for their country, and that puts a lot of pressure on the government. If you notice, not only is the age distribution changing, but China's economy is having to slow, not just because of that, but because you can't be the world's factory floor forever. You've got to learn how to innovate, generate much more productivity per worker, and that's a lot of pressure for the government. So the government really has to step up. And otherwise, these people are going to be very dissatisfied, right? Not just those who are at the bottom of the social ladder, but people at the top of the social ladder as well. So this government has a lot of pressure to deliver. On the other side, I could draw out a variety of pessimistic scenarios about how things could go wrong. If you just look at what they've done with the stock market, a lot of debt, challenges, the explosion in Tianjin recently with the chemical factory, and how that could be replicated in many different places, the outward flow of currency from the country now that could precipitate a crisis. We could all think of a lot of scary things, and I think that's why I think this government operates a lot by fear of those worries. But the other point I wanted to make is that the youth also are a supply. They're not just demands, they are problem solvers for all of these problems. They are super smart, highly motivated, they are good organizers, and particularly folks like Yang Hailian, who don't have the social safety net that others have. And in fact, there's a really interesting study, it must have been about 15 years ago, by a sociologist who looked at norm development in China. And he found, actually, this is Monty Broaded, found a China Journal article where he found that actually the folks with the most, quote unquote, modern values, independence, are actually rural Chinese. So, and urban Chinese who depend on the social safety net and state-owned enterprises and stuff, they actually have their hands out more often. I think that's changed since then because the urbanites has been so much privatization. But there's so much resources. And it's not just about the government, using these resources and supply, but the government willing to allow non-state provision of public goods. So one of the great things about studying philanthropy in China is that there is a huge gap between the government's capacity and the problems. And that gap, that's got to be solved by philanthropy. Not just individual volunteering, but by organizations, by NGOs. And if the government were to give the adequate space to Chinese NGOs, whether they're social entrepreneurs or traditional organizations, I have great confidence that China would be able to overcome a lot of the things that we fear and we read about in the newspapers every day.
So, yes, Dan.
I was going to say something about values.
Sure.
Scott brought it up. One of the surveys I brought with me, which was just published this year, your university's Fudan, I assume, right?
Yeah.
This is from Fudan University. It was in the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences internal journal. And they asked, it was about 1,200 university students at 7 different universities, a whole series of questions. One was, what is the biggest problem facing China today? 24.7% said the lack of mainstream values. Second, 11% environmental issues. Third, corruption. So more than twice as much as anything else, whether it's environment or corruption, was the fact we don't have a value system.
What do you think that means? Do you think it's the lack of a traditional Confucian value system? Or when they say we don't have a value system,
Well,
what do you think that
Confucian
means?
value system, and some people like Daniel Bell would disagree, but the Confucian value system has gone. When they were asked why, the same survey, why is there this problem? The largest number said it's a problem of social ethics and morality, and there's a lot of articles and surveys on why can't we trust each other in China, cover stories in major magazines in China. So social ethics and morality. Second, substantial number said it's basically the political system, it's the system. And third, it's the policies and regulations of the government, about 16.7%. But number one was the fact we lacked the social ethics and morality, because we've had traditional Chinese ethics and morality, but that's all been pushed aside with all this, if you want to call it westernization or modernization. You've got a lot of competing value systems going on, and materialism is number one. There was a survey done by a French public opinion agency, Ipsos, recently, all over the world, and China was an outlier. For example, on average, 34% tied happiness to materialism, material goods. In China, it was 71%, almost twice as much. And on 2/3 of the people in China said, I feel under tremendous stress and pressure to make as much money as possible to get the material goods. And if you look at, one last point on that, because I work on the China Dream and the American Dream comparison, and I brought some things. Shanghai Daily did an interesting study on what is the China Dream to you. And they started from very young. The youngest was Ding Yihong, 6 years old, primary school student. And then they went all the way up. But 6-year-old said, what is my dream? My dream is to study in America, play piano better than Lang Lang, and perform concerts all over the world. They highlighted that. The 22-year-old account executive, they highlighted, my dream is to find a good husband who is honest and economically stable, has an apartment, has a car. It's all about materialism.
And very, very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about how this all interacts in terms of something that U.S. policymakers are constantly concerned about. Now, whether or not they should be is another question, and that's sort of the militarization of China. In terms of there's highly educated people and not necessarily the supply of white-collar jobs to absorb that population. We have an excess population of young, unmarried men from more modest backgrounds. How does this all come together to sort of lead to a solution where the state is motivated to expand the military base in China because it has the absorptive capacity to take that extra energy from the male population?
Well, why don't I give you a sort of general overview, and then from a personal perspective, Ankai could speak to that. But my sense is that when you talk to Chinese people, they do have strong political views. You can have a great discussion with people, and there's lots of different views. But I think that the party has a great ability to mold public opinion in China. And you see it every day when you watch TV, in the newspapers, and of course their efforts to control what goes over the internet. And I think that does, over a long period of time, have a big effect on how Chinese people look at the world and their place. Now certainly there's a lot of things that the United States government does wrong. That's why we're in Washington, D.C., right. By the way. Exactly. So there's lots of, yes. And when we criticize the U.S. government's specific policies, no one says that I'm anti-American, at least in front of me. But when Chinese criticize, or foreigners criticize, certain American policies or things, that's called anti-American. So whether or not you're anti-American is usually it's more about who you are, who says it, as opposed to what you say. But Chinese have a variety of views, but I think are heavily affected by the Chinese government. I think the Chinese government, for some reason, has decided that it's better to promote a more assertive foreign policy that develops China's influence in the region and elsewhere, and calls on these types of stereotypes of others, not just the United States, but Japan, and highlights these to its own advantage. Now, I think they could call on a much more peace-oriented, patriotic value system that wouldn't generate that. Now, I know that that people in China tend to have a overall very negative view of Japan. Any polling shows that. But if you look at popular opinion in Japan about the role of the military force, if you look at Germany, other places, you'll see you can have a strong influence you can have a very modern, internationally oriented populist and foreign policy and economic policy that doesn't focus on military affairs. So I think there's actually a lot of room that the Chinese government has to maneuver, that they're not boxed in. I think it's just a choice that they're deciding to make. I don't think it's necessarily the right choice. Yeah.
Do you want to comment on this?
Maybe from their point of view, I think they think it's the smart choice. When you consider, what I would say, and this again comes out in surveys very clearly, if you look at what Chinese youth, and I hate to, I'm against generalization, but I think I try and do it here.
But you'll generalize anyway.
Yeah, they see two Chinas and two Americas, basically. And friends of mine have done survey research. I edit a translation journal. We've translated some of these surveys, which could not be published in China because they're too sensitive. But detailed surveys among university students all over the country. They see they're very favorable toward a strong China. You can see the pride in the 70th anniversary military parade. And it was quite surprising to a lot of people, because even those who were very satirical and cynical on the internet, I've got text messages from China from people who were very critical, studying in the United States and back for the summer and just coming back now, said, "I'm proud to be a Chinese." This is good from the Chinese government's point of view. And that's one China. They're very critical, as Scott says, of American foreign policy, because the attitude, perhaps true, is that the United States doesn't want to see another superpower. That makes sense. That they want to stop China's rise. So they're very critical of American foreign policy, hegemonist, very supportive of what China is doing. The second America is American culture, American society, even American politics. The surveys show that elite university students prefer the American political system to the Chinese political system. We've translated the survey because
they haven't experienced this system necessarily.
No, but they think separation of powers is great.
Right.
Hundreds of people in this survey of the most elite universities in China, not a single one had completely negative feelings about separation of powers. 75% held it positive. It's the only way to fight corruption in China. It can't be done within the party itself. So American culture, I can give you a lot of data on American TV shows. The better the university, the elite key point schools, the more likely they are to watch American shows and not Chinese shows. If you get down to vocational colleges, then they watch the Chinese shows, not the American shows, because they don't understand the American shows so well. You look at party membership as an indicator, more party members, young party members, prefer American shows than non-party members. So it's the elite of China that are really attracted to American culture. Chinese culture, because of the censorship, if you watch, as Scott was suggesting, that if you watch Chinese TV series, especially now with the 70th anniversary, it's all about the Japanese in the Second World War and people actually tearing Japanese apart with their bare hands. That's counterproductive. The last thing I'll say about this, because it's so interesting to me, was House of Cards. Now, the Chinese government was very happy to show House of Cards because it shows the corruption of the American political system. And they love Kevin Spacey when he becomes vice president saying, I'm a heartbeat away from the presidency, and he didn't get a single vote. Isn't democracy wonderful? They love that. They don't see the irony. And in fact, some of the people in the microblogs were saying, how dare the American Ministry of Propaganda allow this show to be aired? The point being is we don't have a Ministry of Propaganda.
Right.
So some people say it's a victory for Chinese soft power. I say House of Cards is a great victory for American soft power.
Interesting. Very interesting. I'll have to catch up on my House of Cards watching.
Yeah, you live in Washington.
I have
I
a couple
do.
points
I
of,
try to avoid. I get enough politics and during the day. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about social enterprise. And Scott, you mentioned this as a positive development to fill this gap of social needs that really has to be addressed in order for China to move into more economic growth and more political stability and all of those good things. And Ankai, from your point of view, and any of you, do you think that's a place where the Chinese state will begin to invest? Or do you think that that's a place where organizations like IYF or other international organizations will have to come in and support young Chinese social entrepreneurs and volunteers? How do you see that playing out?
So first of all, I wanted to comment a bit on how the social aspect of China can be translated into the economic aspect. I'm not going to comment further than that, but see, there are 30 million more male than female. What's the result of that? There's oversupply of male when it comes to the marriage market. Households have to save up to buy a car, buy a house, so that the boys are more attractive to women. But that's actually in some way translating to the high savings rate in China. So there has been a study basically looked at how when the one-child policy was put into place and the ultrasound detection system was popular in China, how that correlates with the buildup of the foreign reserve in the Chinese. So I think it's really interesting. People think that it's a strategic move, but in some way it's also correlated with the social demography in China. And that's how the social sector actually can have an impact on the bigger economic picture of it. And then talking about the social sector, I think Chinese society is really, it's aging, right? And there are a lot of needs calling for social sector. And I think, as Scott was pointing out, there's big room for the social tech sector to play a role. Just from a personal perspective, all these people involved in the social enterprise back in university, one of them went on to be the producer of one of the Chinese show on women's rights that we call Half the Sky on the national TV. So she's making an impact by advocating on the media about social issues, about gender issues. And another girl who's now running the program of 10,000 women, which I think is part of Goldman Sachs' initiative to empower women economically. So you see, I think as a young person, the kind of experience really feeds into our value system, and it builds a career in some way that's contribute to the society. So I think that's why investment in youth is really investment in the future. And I think the philanthropic sector in China is really growing, and it has a lot of more potential to grow. I think yesterday there was a day for online fundraising, actually. There was a website basically calling for young internet users to donate by internet. And I think they collected something like 100 million RMB in a day. So I think there's big demand and big supply of fundraising in the social sector, and I think there are a lot of future to see in that sector.
And do any of you want to comment on sort of what can the U.S. government or U.S. philanthropy do to harness this and promote it? Is that something we ought to be thinking about in terms of our foreign policy vis-a-vis China or not?
Sure. Well, let me say a little bit about philanthropy in general, since and how it fits into today's topic and what the U.S. could do. So, philanthropy in China accounts for about 0.5% of GDP. It's about $100 billion US a year. In the United States and OECD countries, it's about 1.5% of GDP. So, it's grown very quickly, but it's still relatively small compared to the overall size of the economy. The primary places that philanthropy is invested is in education. It's number one, by far the largest target recipient of philanthropy, followed by the environment, and then disaster relief. There's other healthcare, but those are the dominant ones. There are about 3,500 foundations in China, all created in the last 10 to 12 years, because there wasn't any regulations for foundations before. 70% of philanthropy in China is corporate philanthropy, which is, it's about 50-50 in the United States, individual versus organizational. So it's grown quickly, but it's still, as a proportion of the economy, still relatively small. Youth, again, as I was saying before, are big participants, not as the donors. They're the donors when they're the CEO of Tencent or Jack Ma
Right.
of Alibaba. And Jack Ma's, he created a trust, a $1 billion trust to go primarily towards education and environmental issues. But for the most part, they are volunteers. And also recipients. An organization that we work with based in Hong Kong, actually two American-born Chinese who went to Yale created this organization in Hong Kong to train Chinese youth how to be philanthropists.
Great.
And they have really exciting programs, online programs, face-to-face programs. They're really terrific. But there's two big problems with philanthropy and addressing issues that are particularly important for youth. The first is capacity. Chinese foundations, NGOs, have very weak capacity to identify projects, to figure out how to solve them, how to implement, how to evaluate what they've done. And that's just a huge capacity problem, just basic technical ability about how to run a foundation or an NGO. The second is that there's a big trust gap. I think Stan already mentioned the problem of trust and values in China. That's not just at the individual level, it's also at institutional level. And folks, a lot of foundations are created by people who recently became very wealthy, and they think that they can do everything. That tends to be the self-confidence that they have. And they really don't want to give their money to an NGO that's run by someone they've never heard of and don't know. Because they think that money will go down a black hole. And they're right. A lot of the times. So in the United States, 95% of foundations are giving foundations, right? Only 5% run their own programs. In China, it's the exact opposite. 95% of foundations in China run their own programs, which isn't a good, foundations really not built to run all their own programs. So that's an issue. The last is regulatory challenges. China doesn't have a full-grown charity law. It's drafting one, but giving isn't tax exempt. Only certain types of foundations can raise money from the public. There's a whole variety of challenges. And then, of course, hopefully everyone is familiar with a draft law the Chinese have been developing on international NGOs that will operate in China. The Ford Foundation, the Luce Foundation, a lot of smaller foundations, the Gates Foundation, of course, a very large foundation, all operating in China, have offices in China where they travel back and forth. And this new law that they're drafting is going to put an immense amount of constraints on the activities of these organizations. This law is for international NGOs as a whole, so not just foundations and nonprofit service-related organizations, but professional organizations, chambers of commerce, CSIS, and other think tanks. So a huge thing that we need to do is to let the Chinese government know how important we are in filling that gap.
Right.
Because of the lack of trust between Chinese foundations and NGOs, actually international foundations are a huge source of funding for Chinese NGOs. And if the clamps are put on foreign international foundations, that's going to those domestic NGOs are going to have a very hard time of developing. A lot of them are actually really interesting and innovative and deserve support. And again, they're critical to solving a lot of problems.
Wow, very interesting. So, potentially a place for U.S. foreign policy to engage in sort of creating more openness for
sure.
this sector in China. So I want to open it up to questions or comments. Have you joined the conversations? Anybody want to begin? Yes, please, if you would identify yourself.
My name is Arjun Singh. I really liked the conversation. It was really interesting. Thanks. Appreciate it. I really liked the points that were made. But just changing the paradigm a little bit from, say, China and US or just China alone, I'm also looking from the paradigm of, say, India. I feel like a lot of the issues that were touched upon here are similar or even identical to India, just from my experience traveling there, spending quite a bit of time in the rural areas, helping with social issues with my grandmother over there. And so I'm just curious to know, is there any potential, given that in this region there is a lot of geopolitical competition, there's a lot of ideas of foreign policy, military buildup. I'm just curious to know about youth interaction. Is there any move within the region, say within China or reciprocal neighboring countries, for youth to come together and find common solutions to Asian issues? You don't really hear about that often, and I was just curious if anyone could touch upon that.
Great. Great insight. Yeah, do any of you want to comment?
Oh, gosh. It's very hard with some countries. India may be a little different, but I remember, and Scott may be too young to remember this, but he knows about it, I'm sure. Well, Hu Yaobang, when he was the leader of China, invited the 3,000 Japanese youth to come to China. That was one of the things that led to his downfall, wasting money on Japanese youth. I think there are possibilities, certainly. There is that kind of dance between Modi in India and the leadership in China, looking at each other as potential rivals. But there certainly are more and more students going to China to study. If you look at the figures on number of Chinese students going abroad, number of foreign students going to China, they're constantly increasing. And I think that's probably where the best interactions take place, rather than short-term delegations, as Hu Yaobang and others have tried in the past. But there's people going there for a year or 2 years, even getting a degree there. And I think that's happening more and more. That's probably the best way that could take place.
That's a great question. Yeah. Any others? Comments, questions, ideas, anything?
A lot of Korean students in China, Korean and Japanese. In fact, I knew I'd get a chance to show this, that's why I brought it along. One of the main popular magazines in China, Sanlian Shenhuo Zhoukan, the Sanlian Life Weekly, has almost a whole issue on why is South Korea so cool? Why aren't we cool? And so, I mean, South Korean cultures, even Japanese anime, these things are very, very popular in China. And the interaction is taking place at that level, too, in terms of popular culture.
Yes, sir.
Professor Risman, you spoke about the importance of disaggregating.
Yes.
Hold on just 1 second. We're going to get you the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Daniel Ejok. I'm a graduate student at Indiana University. And Professor Risman, you spoke about how we need to disaggregate people, how there's no sort of one monolithic type of a young Chinese person. In my research that I've done, I've tried to look at variation among Chinese student populations in the United States. And I guess one thing that I think is really important to talk about is that the population that we see now on US campuses and in the US is a substantially different population than existed in the early 2000s. And we saw a turning point around 2008 where almost all of the growth has been undergraduate students. In your research, have you seen sort of like the demographic and social backgrounds? Have you seen a different social background that is coming to the US? I guess I'm specifically speaking economically. Are the people coming post-2008 of a much different economic class than the previous generation? Thank you.
It's a very good question. I mean, my university, USC, has 4,300 students from mainland China, not counting Hong Kong or Taiwan. That's more than 10% of the student body. You walk on campus, you hear Chinese all the time. I have students in my classes, Chinese undergraduates now. It's kind of, but they're still reasonably quite well off because they can afford tuition at a private school. I remember once when I assigned Leslie Chang's book on Chinese factories, a very good book, one of my students came up to me and said, you know, that's a very interesting book. I have a somewhat different impression because my father owns most of those factories.
Interesting.
So, I mean, so you do have a, but certainly, it's a broad question. One thing that struck me when I was directing East Asian Studies and had a lot of teaching assistants for large classes, one Chinese student came to see me and said, I want to be your TA. I said, why? He said, I want to teach American students to love China as much as I do. I said, well, I'm not sure that's the best reason to be a TA since you don't know anything about the subject. But now I'm finding Chinese students are much more balanced in terms of their views. The patriotism, of course, is still there, but they have a greater openness, I think, than was the case, as you pointed out, 10 or more years ago. I think that's been a big change as the numbers have kind of increased and as the number of undergraduates has increased. We're not getting all the people in the sciences only anymore. We have plenty of people studying international relations. Economics is always very popular, political science even, communications. And these people have really been influenced. You can call it he ping yan bian. You can call it peaceful evolution if you want to use from the Chinese term. But basically, they've been heavily influenced by watching American British shows, American films, and so we're seeing a much broader range of people, even if they're well off. And of course, you always have those that have scholarships, too. The other thing I'm finding, again at USC, is, and again, these are some of the most open people, is their parents came to get their PhDs in the US and stayed on.
Yeah.
And their kids went to high school here, even primary school, and they're very American, more and more American. I still speak Chinese, of course, but they've really had all that experience in the United States, and that's, and I guess I don't even know if they're counted among the 4,300, but that's certainly from China.
And how many is it common for Chinese students to study here and not return to China? I mean, your experience, Ankai, you came, you studied in China?
Yeah, I did my undergrads in
And then
China,
you made your
and
way
then
to Switzerland.
Yeah, exactly.
How did that happen?
I went to Switzerland to study international relations, exactly, and then I thought I was going back to China after my master's program, but then I get a job opportunity at the World Trade Organization, which I think it's a phenomenon for its own sake because China is becoming the biggest trading country in the world, and there are more and more demand for a Chinese-speaking person to be in the organization communicating with the Chinese-speaking community. So I think my kind of experience reflects the fact that China is playing more role in the international community and sort of, I mean, I live overseas, but my work is largely related with China as well. So I think it's just Chinese people having more impact in the global picture.
But in general, are most of the students that are studying abroad returning home to China? Is that the general trend?
Well, you have to, again, disaggregate between graduate students, undergraduate students,
Okay.
and
MBAs.
I was involved in a study with David Zweig, who's still continuing to, he has a book coming out on this subject. We did surveys in the United States and Canada on whether they would return or not. And this was published maybe in the mid-90s. And we've done some other articles since, but he's carrying on. I'm doing other things now. He's carrying on, and he's got big data sets on this subject. And I would say people are returning because they're go through a lot of reasons why. The numbers are not as large as the people not returning, I would say, in terms of the actual numbers. But they don't have the glass ceiling as you might have here. They're given research funds to set up laboratories rather than being part of someone else's laboratory.
Right.
To get promoted, and I've looked at surveys again from Peking University, for example, some of their internal surveys on who gets promoted and why. And you have to have that overseas experience to get promoted. You have to be abroad for at least a year and a half normally if you want to be a department chair in certain departments. So the influence of that overseas study, you have to publish. As I edit a journal, and I'm constantly getting submissions from China. I have to tell them, this is a translation journal, we don't publish secondary articles, but they desperately have to have that overseas publishing. Yeah,
Interesting.
I think that's what's going on.
So, any other questions? Yes, please. If you would wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ray. I work with the Global Business Policy Council at A.T. Kearney. We're doing some research on millennials, and I wonder if you've done some cross-country comparisons, because a lot of the research on Chinese youth, what you talk about, also seems quite similar with American youth in terms of the first generation to be exposed with the internet, and they're also the me generation. So I was wondering if you can share some insights on how different or similarities cross-country, if you came across.
Talking to me?
Well,
Yeah,
I think you are, I mean, in terms of,
Go ahead. You go ahead.
I don't, the short answer is, I don't know the specifics enough of US millennials versus Chinese millennials, but I do think the digital native experience is one that is now cross-cultural around the world and is a common experience for young people. And I think time will tell how that socialization will impact, international relations in 50 years in the future, when you have people who grew up with the same kind of access to information, et cetera. So, beyond that, it would all be speculation for me to say, compare and contrast U.S. millennials, but Stan, please.
Well, no, you can always find similarities as well as differences. One of the things that struck me, and I have you read Chinese, I'm sure, but I brought this article along among many from this summer, came out just recently this year. There's a big debate. If you read the Chinese media, especially ideological journals, it's all about socialist core values. How do we build a social? This is different from the U.S., where people just assume we have individualism here. The Chinese are trying to promote something other than that, collectivism, and building a strong nation. But they're trying to get Chinese youth to believe in quote-unquote socialist core values. And if you read some of the articles, what are socialist core values? The surveys show that most youth have no idea what socialist core values are, maybe 2.5%. They don't know what they are. So they're kind of toning them down so they just be a good person, basically. So then you start to see articles like this one, that socialist core values cannot depart from politics. It has to be Marxist-Leninist. There's a big debate in China, how do we educate our youth? And I think there's the biggest difference to me between Chinese and American youth, because and this goes back as far as you want in Chinese history and imperial China, with the Confucian ideology of the Maoist period, building new socialist man and woman. You've got to have something beyond materialism and individualism. So now it's socialist core values. United States, we think that the American dream, the difference in Chinese and American dreams, American dream can be realized if everybody works hard and is successful. It's kind of what's good for General Motors is good for the USA, that old mentality. In China, though, that's not what the Chinese dream is. You have to combine your individual dreams with the state's dreams, in a sense. And so, again, if you look at surveys, most people say, the very large percentage says, China dream to me is realizing my ideals. Fine, if I can, although it's going to be very difficult to do so. But they don't necessarily tie it other than we want to see a strong military, a strong state, China rising in the world. Yes, that's fine. But I'm not going to compromise my own individual ideals and beliefs. And that's very similar to what, as you say, that's very similar to what U.S. students and U.S. youth think. In that sense, you have a similarity, but you have a very different view in terms of the expectations from the Chinese authorities as to what people should believe in China and the United States. In the United States, all individualism. In China, we want more than just your own individual values and individual success. So it's really a state-sanctioned difference. The individual difference is not there so much, I think. This is why I argue, things I've written, that the American dream is more popular in China than the Chinese dream because of the emphasis on individualism. That anybody, it's an immigrant culture, anybody can succeed if they work hard. If you don't succeed in the United States, it's because you're lazy. That's basically,
Right.
and Chinese youth and Japanese youth, for that matter, have that belief that if you don't succeed in the United States, it's because of you. Whereas some of the surveys in China show if you don't succeed in China, it's because of the system, or because of the lack of mainstream values, or the lack of good policies and laws. It's beyond you. And I think that's a big difference.
Do you think one similarity in millennials that I've observed, which is a very positive one, is American millennials really having a demand that their employers, their businesses, their careers do incorporate some aspect of social good? You know, that there's a strong belief that you can do good and do well, and that those two things are not necessarily in opposition to one another. And I think that's very different than my generation. And I think that's a very positive development. And from what Scott is saying and Ankai's experience, you know, that may be one very positive parallel between millennials all over the world. That yes, it is about me, but it's not sort of screw the rest of the world. It's I want to have what I need, but I want to do it in a way that improves the lives of many people at the same time. So that is, I'm hopeful that will be a positive trend throughout. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, everybody. I'm not a youth. I'm 64 this December. And I'm a development person, and I have technical background. I founded 5 organizations for profits to support my nonprofit. My question is, you mentioned philanthropy. How does this relate? Because I don't necessarily focus on that. It's I'm trying to go back to my school and convince them to change the curriculum to promote social responsibility among the scholars who are graduates. I am one of them.
And where is this?
The Philippine Science High School was founded, patterned after Bronx Science High. And, you know, this is a group of people throughout the country, the best and the brightest, but there are really no facilities for scientists. And now I find that a lot of these scholars just go their merry way overseas, PhD, Harvard, but nobody really goes back. And the school curriculum itself doesn't have that kind of social responsibility curriculum, and their values formation is, what is God? Who is God? So I said, it's not necessarily philanthropy, and I have a mental baggage about millennials because of my ignorance. I'm 64. I tend to just from my heart, in our family, from my heart, our hearts to yours, we look at the youth. So, you know, I see a lot of Chinese coming, and I'm excited by it. Politically, the Philippines and the Chinese, you know, forget about them. And I'm trying to focus on the high school and the college, and in the Philippines, 17, 18 are college graduates. And on the index, the Philippines is 22, number 22. And is there a forum by which the ones that are below can actually do FaceTime with the ones that are up there, so that on a one-on-one basis, regardless of what we development people say up here, they can, you know, face-to-face, and they can exchange and learn from each other, you know, just one student at a time.
So is your question about incorporating social ideals and philanthropy
it's like
in curriculum?
Yeah, that's my approach, but because it's my first time in this kind of environment, and I guess you're launching. right? And how I'm thinking of how I can incorporate, because my target is to raise funds, and well, my son waived his inheritance, right? That's what I'm squandering right now. To sponsor a bunch of scholars, get them FaceTime with, you know, the Chinese who are here in a different environment out of the Philippines, because the travel and the interaction itself, I find, as I found myself, is a lot of learning. Just meeting you guys, it can be very exciting to a very poor young scholar in the Philippines. You know, it is one meal a day. One meal there is $2.50. See, and so if we could like share, and America is very rich, you know that kind of interaction. So my question is, do you anticipate, for example, a moving forum of a bunch of youth like this that we could participate in?
Well, so in terms of will we be able to provide a space where young people can interact with one another in different countries, I hope so. I think that one of our goals with Youth 3D, we're actually doing an event in Hanoi in Vietnam in a few weeks, where some of the young people who have come, and not highly educated, very wealthy young people, but young people who have been able to participate in some work skills and life skill development programs sponsored by Hilton Worldwide, we will enable them to have a platform to speak to policymakers and others in kind of that are in power, quote unquote, in the Vietnamese context. And so that's exactly the kind of thing that we want to do with the youth program at IYF and CSIS, is definitely to create platforms where young people can come together to identify their priorities, articulate those clearly, and then convey those to policymakers. And I think our hope is eventually that we'll have the resources to bring young people from different places together, because I think like the Youth Action Net program is an amazing place where young people learn just as much from one another as they do from the coursework. So yes, I'd like to be able to say yes. So ask me next year.
Yeah. Let me add a little bit to this. I think it's an interesting question. I think I'm going to try and respond to a couple things that have been said. The first thing is in terms of variation. When you ask people about volunteerism, about volunteering, and what does volunteering mean? If you ask your typical American what volunteering means, I guess we could do that here, but I'll just cite some of the data that people have found. Volunteering means an individual self-selects themselves to do something to help others. Philanthropy is doing good, is action to help others. That's the definition of philanthropy. So it's about the self-directedness of it. When you ask Chinese what does volunteering mean, it is that they do something that they don't get paid for. That's what it means. All right. And if you look at most volunteering in China, that's what it is. For young people as they grow up, they volunteer a lot, involuntarily. Their school organizes them to go collect trash or to build something or clean a lake or something like that. And so they learn that other authorities organize them. Originally their school, then their office, their government agency, so externally, top down. And that's a difference. And so I think it's evolving, but the initial starting point of what it means to be a volunteer differs. And I think that's also why a lot of philanthropy that we see in China from companies and stuff, everyone is going, what's the government's priorities? And then we kind of decide, where our funds ought to go a lot of the times. But there is a lot of activity. I don't know if we would call it volunteering, but they're not getting paid, but it's not always self-selected. So really the object in China is how do you get people not just to do something that they're not going to get a check for, but that they decide on their own that they want to do. And I think that's really the kind of transition that we're in right now. We'll say that a small but growing proportion of philanthropy in China is overseas philanthropy. China's per capita income is still about 7,000 US per year. China has, even though it's got, you mentioned, 300 to 400 million middle class, it's got 1.4 billion people, so it's got a lot of people still in poverty. So its biggest needs are at home, and the financially resources, most philanthropy globally is domestically directed anyway, right? But Chinese are starting to give abroad, particularly in Asia. So, and particularly in the wake of natural disasters, typhoons, hurricanes, earthquakes. So to Taiwan, I think it was recently in the Philippines, after the tsunami in Southeast Asia. So so there is that, and there's also Chinese who travel abroad for this. They put together delegations. Maybe it's through the Chinese Red Cross or China Hope or others, or privately based organizations that travel. But it's still a very small percent. But those people are mavericks and forerunners, and to the extent it'll see as China gets wealthier, more whether that will become a larger wave of Chinese going out to engage, and then they would link up with folks in India, and maybe be able to address issues more broadly across the region. I guess one way that might happen is through China's New Silk Road initiative, what they call One Belt, One Road, or Belt and Road, depending how the official name changes, which is supposed to be about developing infrastructure, communications, the hardware of business. But with the hardware of business comes the need to solve real social problems. And so it's possible that along those trains, planes, and boats and highways, you'll also see folks trying to come up with ways to solve other problems that youth could be involved in and addressing.
Ankai, do you want to comment on any
Yeah,
of these
exactly.
trends?
Just about the question on how youth from different parts of the world, different walks of life can come together. I think that's precisely what the Youth Action Net has been doing, because in 2008, when I was here in DC, I was part of a group of 20 young social entrepreneurs from everywhere in the world. We have a fellow from the Philippines whose work is actually it's really interesting. She basically get all the waste from cloth factories, and she founded George Armani of the Philippines, the biggest designer, to design bags, and she engaged rural women to weave all these wasted materials into bags and sell it to the international market. This is remarkable. And throughout the week we were here, we got to speak with professional PR companies to kind of help us understand how to market the social enterprise. We get to speak with policymakers. We get to expose to means of fundraising through internet. And I think that kind of experience would really help the people from developing countries particularly to scale up the social enterprise. And I think it's happening. And also, I think in terms of how youth can voice their opinions, I think the social media and the whole internet campaign can really make a difference, because nowadays, for example, in China, we have the Weibo. It's like the copycat of Twitter, and it's really the place where people can voice their opinions and also see what's happening. It's kind of a checks and balance system that's works in China. And yeah, I think so. Basically, and I think, so for example, when Scott was talking about volunteerism, that just made me think of a lot of Chinese students, for example, they go to teach in rural areas through a program called Teach for China. Mm-hmm. And there has been some criticism saying that they do that so that they can write the experience in their personal statement when they apply for schools in US.
Well,
but what's wrong with that?
That's not uncommon.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's
We have Teach for America.
Right.
Exactly.
We pad our resumes every day.
Right.
Yeah. So I was just thinking, what's wrong with that? Because it's still a way to encourage young people to get some experience. And let's just not look at the kind of intention, but rather the effect of it. I think it's really a positive movement. Yeah.
I would only say one thing about Weibo, the microblogs, which has really declined precipitously because you can reach so many people. You have some of the celebrities with 30 million followers, like a Twitter thing. So the government's really cracked down for the big Vs, the verified accounts, and people have now migrated to WeChat, where they don't affect that many people, but you can talk about among your friends. And that's, again, another difference between China and the US, I think, is the government is very cautious in terms of what they allow, what they don't allow. And this affects NGOs very strongly. I remember years ago, the Ministry of Civil Affairs journal, it was, I think in English, it was something like something relates to something about society. I don't remember the English name, but they had some great articles years ago about when Falun Gong was a problem, the religious group or cult, if you like. How can we defeat Falun Gong in China so people don't join it? Empower NGOs, the natural enemy of these groups. And it was very interesting stuff. We translated it in the journal I edit. Very interesting stuff, but they also have had their wings clipped, Ministry of Civil Affairs, because there's the fear, social stability. So that really puts a damper on a lot of possibilities for reaching large numbers of people and coming up with new solutions.
Great. Other questions, comments? Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amy, and I just work here as an intern. So I had a question. I thought, first of all, that 3 speakers, very exciting, interesting topics. So specifically, I want to ask a little bit about kind of what Dr. Rosen said and Dr. Kennedy said about kind of the lack of core social values, and at the same time, students increasingly being more open to Western ideas. But at the same time, I remember that I think Dr. Kennedy mentioned how a lot of students that come here, they still are very nationalistic or become even more so as they examine more political systems. And I was just wondering why, or how that is, kind of why on the social side it's somehow harder to sustain kind of a core value system, whereas on the political side, is it somehow different? And especially given the fact, I mean, as far as I know, it seems that kind of Confucian values and such are also taught to many Chinese students when they're very young, and essentially why there is a difference. Is there kind of like an answer on that? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, good question.
Terrific question, Amy. You know, in the United States, when you talk about core social values, I mean, people mention individualism, but if you come to my house, there's a lot of group activity, and if you went to the house when I was growing up, there's a lot of group activity and supporting the public good. I think in the United States, we don't talk about we do talk about a breakdown in social values, sometimes particularly like when there's crime or drug abuse or things like that, we talk about it. But we don't harp on it as much as it seems to come up in the Chinese context. And I think the reason why is because we somehow believe that there needs to be an official imprimatur of what the social values are supposed to be that are acceptable, and that the existing official line of what those values are, people don't accept. People don't believe in socialist whatever. They don't believe the propaganda, even if they believe some of the things behind it. You know, people aren't doing political study. They're not that. People don't think about things in the terms of Marxist, Leninist, dialectical materialism and stuff like that. But I still think Chinese people have lots of very interesting, complex social values, where there are important norms, where you can find a partner and friends, where the bonds between you aren't just about the fact that you're pursuing wealth together, but that you also have common values about what's good for society, what you want your children to be like, what you want the air to be clean. It's just that people don't agree on the way that the state is presenting it. So they think that there's a vacuum. Actually, I don't think it's a vacuum. It's that you have so much there going on at the same time. But I think it's fine. I think we just need to stop waiting. There's already those values there. We just need to stop waiting for this expectation that we need the imprimatur of the state. And then I think Chinese will be fine. But it's also difficult to expect that there will be one standard source of values when you've got so much variation in the country changing so quickly and so much variation across. So to expect that, I think on this I would just say, relax. don't worry so much. I am less worried about the value systems of the Chinese than they are.
Yeah, I don't often hear that as a foreign policy recommendation. Relax. So,
This is Jamaican foreign policy.
Great. We like that. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, just a couple of quick points related to that. I think the difference is what Scott's talking about. It's fine, but social values are not the same as socialist values.
Sure. Right.
And that's the government. If you read these documents from China, it's basically it's socialist core values. They don't want good social values alone. After all, why do we need the Communist Party as a vanguard party if you're not going to achieve communism? So if you don't have a one-party system, you don't have to worry about the difference between socialist values and social values. And this affects policies across the board. One of the areas I work on is film industry, Hollywood and China. And you have Liu Qibao, the head of propaganda, saying we're in a war with Hollywood, both domestically and overseas in terms of the film industry, promoting Chinese films against Hollywood domestically in China, but also overseas. So we have to defeat Hollywood. And so we want our films to be successful overseas. And then he also says, and we want our films to have socialist core values. Well, there's a basic contradiction there, even in China. If you want your films to be successful, let's say in the United States, and putting socialist core values in the film, that is not going to help you. So he's appealing to Xi Jinping and his colleagues on the Politburo and the Standing Committee because that's how he survives as a politician. But if you're a filmmaker and you're expected to have socialist core values and still conquer the domestic and over, you watch a movie like Xiao Shidai, Tiny Times in China. People can laugh about that. It's hard to find anybody who says a good thing about the film. There are 4 of them now. And I have a lot of stuff. Guo Jingming, the author of the book and the director of the film, he lives in this really fancy 3-story apartment. He promotes materialism and nothing else. It's as somebody said, it's Sex in the City without the sex, basically. So it's all about leading a material life. That film will not do well overseas, but it will do very well in China. It has no socialist core values or even social values, for that matter. But you have to decide, what do you want? Do you want to succeed in terms of box office, or do you want to succeed, as Mao did, in terms of creating a new socialist man and woman? You can't have both.
So just to wrap up, we have a few minutes left. I want to bring this back to the CSIS kind of specialty, which is we're in the business of giving the U.S. government advice that it may or may not want, right? That's really what we're about. And in terms of the conversation that we've had today, if you had to sort of make one recommendation to the U.S. State Department vis-a-vis China policy, from a youth lens, what would you recommend that John Kerry do differently?
I'll let somebody else say something first, then I can criticize it.
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily differently, but
Or more.
or
Better.
more. But I do think that, and I don't think that they've done things that are strongly differently. But we really need. Not only does China need a state with high capacity, it needs a state that does the right things and knows what it can't do. All right, and so it needs to be accepting, encouraging, supportive of not just getting out of the way, but creating the right regulatory environment for non-state actors. And so you're not going to fulfill the potential of Chinese youth, address the problems that they face, or solve the country's overall problems. And of course, the problems of the country are really the problems of the youth, right? So if you can't do that, so you need to strengthen state capacity and all the things it does, and then allow the state to do all the other different things. And in the current conversation, what that is making sure that the international NGO law that they end up passing and implementing doesn't constrain NGO activity in a way that is going to lead them away from that. That's the number one thing that's on the agenda right now between the two governments.
Great.
You want to go for it?
Yeah, sure. So you can criticize me afterwards.
No, I promise not to.
I'm kidding. I think, today the Chinese people are getting more and more confident because they know that the economic system kind of works, and it's the country is growing. The country is growing not just in terms of the economic growth, but also the impact in the world. So I think rather than imposing from a very macro point of view in the policy, I think the social development and policies to try to encourage the social tech sector to grow would really make a difference in China. I think now China has a growing middle class, and the middle class demands have clean air, have clean water, have a better society to live in, and I think that's really positive change that can bring a lot of difference to the country. Yeah.
Okay. My basic response would be don't do incredibly stupid things. And I'll give you an example. The problem in the United States, or maybe it's the solution, maybe it's not a problem, is we have a separation of powers, which is a good thing, but not necessarily always a good thing with Congress. So it's not the State Department that's necessarily doing bad things, but Congress is often doing bad things. Give you an example. In 1993, the Congress passed a resolution that China should not be given the Olympics in the year 2000 because of human rights violations. And so they lost to Sydney, Australia, 43 votes to 41 votes. The surveys, again, done in China at the major universities, showed more than 75% of the students, who were very pro-American at the time, were outraged that the U.S. Congress would tell the International Olympic Committee what to do. Not that anyone's going to listen to the U.S. Congress, but maybe they get a couple of votes, extra votes back home because of standing up for human rights. It's those kinds of things, that kind of counterproductive interference in what China does that I think is incredibly stupid. And that there's like when I was pre-med and going to go to med school and so on, the first thing you learn is do no harm as a doctor. And the United States government often does harm to its own interests.
Well, we can have a seminar after seminar after seminar here at CSIS about recommendations to what the Congress should and shouldn't do. We've just had a big session we're having it this afternoon on Iran upstairs. The Congress should and shouldn't do. But I'll write it up anyway and I'll send it over.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. We have some refreshments outside. If you'll please join us for a few minutes, and gives you an opportunity to continue the conversation with our panelists. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panel.